I never imagined I'd become the central villain in a suburban power drama. But here I am sitting at the edge of my dock with a cold amber lager in hand, watching a small crowd of frustrated HOA members standing at the shore like angry tourists, denied entry to their favorite resort. Behind them, the sun reflects off the placid waters of Cedar Lake like molten glass, and the echoes of years-long traditions dissolve quietly in the humid afternoon air. It's the first day of the annual Cedar Lake Fishing Festival, the most sacred week on this side of the county. Except this year, there's no fishing. Not from the main pier, not from the banks, and certainly not from the newly planned HOA fishing deck that never got built. The only usable access left is the very dock I'm sitting on. My dock, and I alone hold the keys. Just a year ago, I was a quiet transplant from the city, a former investigative journalist who traded deadlines for lake mornings and Word documents for bait casting reels. I came here with my wife Melanie to settle into a slower rhythm, to breathe again. We bought her grandfather's old lakefront home, a weathered but sturdy place that stood like a memory on the shoreline, the dock. That was the real reason. Built in 1959, every plank carried the ghost of summers long gone. It was never supposed to be a battlefield, but when they tried to fence me off from my own shoreline and smiled like they'd already won, I realized something they didn't. This wasn't just about a dock. This was going to be war, and I don't lose wars. The day we signed the papers for the Harper property, the wind was calm, and the lake looked like something out of a painting. Melanie stood beside me, silent, her eyes locked on the old dock that stretched 30 feet out into the water, like a hand reaching for something lost. Her grandfather, Samuel Harper, had built that dock in 1959, with little more than sweat pine boards and stubborn determination. It had weathered 6 decades of sunstorms and shifting shoreline. Now it stood firm like it always had, waiting for another generation to breathe life into it. There were still initials carved into the first support beam, SH-59. Quiet mark that time had softened but not erased. That dock wasn't just lumber and nails. It was a living heirloom, a symbol of family summers spent fishing at dawn, cannonball splashes in July, and slow walks under rust-red October skies. Melanie grew up on it. I saw it for the first time and felt like I was meeting someone sacred. The house needed work. Shingles curled, gutters sagged, paint peeled at the corners. But that dock, perfect, untouched by fashion, politics, or the passage of years. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. As a man who'd spent most of his adult life chasing scandals and ugly truths, I was ready for something rooted. My new home office overlooked the water. Every day, after logging off, I walked straight down the slope to that dock with a rod in hand and the hum of silence in my ears. No deadlines, no editors, just fish wind and memory. For 2 weeks, life was exactly what I thought I'd been missing, until the letter came. The people at Cedar Lake Reserve had a way of smiling that made you feel like you'd stepped into a Norman Rockwell painting until you looked a little closer. The first few days, we received baskets of fruit, jars of peach preserves, and handwritten welcome notes that looked like they came from a bygone decade. It was charming, comforting even. We met retirees, weekenders, and 1 or 2 young couples with lake-loving golden retrievers. But underneath the surface of potlucks and polite waves was a deep undercurrent of tradition, one that everyone kept circling back to: the Cedar Lake Fishing Festival. They spoke of it the way some towns talk about the 4th of July or Thanksgiving. For 45 years, the festival had marked the crown jewel of summer. People from neighboring counties came in droves. There were prizes, big ones for the heaviest bass and most impressive haul. Local restaurants set up food stalls along the water. There were fireworks, bluegrass concerts, and storytelling contests for kids. Or one night even featured a candlelight paddle parade, a floating procession of kayaks and canoes lit up like lanterns. It was the heartbeat of this place. Businesses made 30% to 40% of their annual income during that week. Families booked their lake house rentals a year in advance. There were elders who hadn't fished in decades, but still came down just to cheer on their grandchildren from the shore. I was told the base tournament was especially competitive. Veteran anglers had rivalries that spanned generations. There was even a running joke that Cedar Lake produced more bruised egos than trophy fish. I had planned to enter the tournament not to win, just to be part of something that felt woven into the soil here. I even bought a new tackle box and dusted off the graphite rod I hadn't used since college. I imagined Melanie sitting on the dock with a sun hat, cheering me on as I reeled in a spotted bass under the shimmer of twilight. That week, I felt like I was becoming part of something. A place, a story, a legacy. Then came the envelope on my doorstep, stamped with the HOA seal. Inside it, a letter that changed everything. It was the kind of letter that didn't need bold print to feel aggressive. Just a formal font, a crest at the top, and the heavy scent of bureaucracy. The Cedar Lake Reserve Homeowners Association had decided unilaterally that the dock behind our house was in violation of community regulations. According to them, it no longer met the architectural and aesthetic standards of lakeside properties and would need to be removed within 30 days. I reread the letter 3 times, thinking it had to be a mistake. The dock had stood there since 1959, 3 decades before the HOA even existed. But buried in the legalese was the clause they intended to exploit: transfer of property. Nullifies grandfathered exceptions. In their eyes, because Melanie and I had bought the house from the estate, the protections tied to Samuel Harper's ownership evaporated the moment we signed. I called the number listed on the letter. I wanted clarity. What I got was Miranda Kellerman. She had the polished tone of someone who'd read too many management books and learned all the wrong lessons. Her words were sweet, her intent venomous. She acknowledged the dock's historical character, but dismissed it as irrelevant to current policy. She assured me the HOA wasn't targeting me personally. It was simply about maintaining standards, preserving value, ensuring safety. The word community floated through her sentences like a shield. I countered with history. She replied with policy. I brought up heritage. She talked liability, and just like that, I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a move. Still clinging to logic, I offered compromise. I suggested inspection. I referenced permits she declined with synthetic politeness. By the end of the call, I was no longer just a new resident. I was an obstacle. That night, Melanie sat quietly beside me on the dock as the sun dipped behind the trees. Her grandfather had built every plank by hand with nails he'd hammered himself. This place had stood through storms, droughts, and decades of family memories, and now it was under threat because someone with a title and a grudge wanted it gone. I felt the first flicker of something colder than anger strategy. I wasn't looking to start a war. Not yet. But something about Miranda's tone, the smug finality, the rehearsed condescension, left a splinter in my gut that wouldn't settle. That night, while walking a trash bag to the bin near the road, I caught voices drifting through the warm evening air. The HOA president herself was strolling just past my property line with a tall man I'd seen before, Douglas Pike, one of the board members with a fondness for monogrammed polos and real estate newsletters. They paused near the tree line, thinking themselves out of earshot. I remained still in the shadows. What I heard confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The dock wasn't the problem. It was the view. Miranda, in her measured cadence, complained that the structure blocked her sightlines from across the inlet. She gestured vaguely toward my shoreline, her voice curling with irritation. Then came the real motive. The HOA had plans to construct a new community fishing pier just east of my property. Something modern, functional, and festival-ready, as she put it. But my dock was in the way, both visually and politically. They needed it gone, preferably before the festival. Clean slate, fresh ribbon cutting. I stood there in the dark, heart-slowing mind, accelerating. This wasn't about bylaws. It was about leverage, territory, control, and unfortunately for them, I wasn't built to fold. Back in my office, I pulled up county plat maps and architectural overlays. I started reading case law, HOA covenants, and riparian doctrine with the hunger of a man who once dissected corruption for a living. I'd spent a decade exposing fraud in boardrooms and city councils. I wasn't about to get steamrolled by a lakeside clique with clipboards and fake smiles. By morning, the pieces had started falling into place. The HOA wanted the pier to anchor the festival, and Miranda wanted to oversee it from her back porch, without so much as a shadow of my dock ruining her ambiance. But I had something better than a view. I had documentation. I had legacy. And I was just getting started. By sunrise, I was already 3 cups of coffee deep and surrounded by printed maps, HOA bylaws, and legal statutes that hadn't seen daylight since the late 80s. I shut down my freelance assignments for the week and turned my home office into a war room. Monitors glowed with overlapping PDFs, county records, historical permits, riparian law precedents. I wasn't just angry. I was activated. Melanie, ever perceptive, brought me lunch without asking questions. But before she left the room, she mentioned something that made me pause. Her grandfather, meticulous to a fault, had always kept permits for everything. If he built that dock himself, odds were he'd made sure it was all done legally. Permits, approvals, the whole bureaucratic ballet that led me to the county archives. Buried in a scanned file from 1959 was exactly what I needed, a hand-signed dock permit issued before the HOA even existed. Not only did it establish the dock's legitimacy, it confirmed that the structure was grandfathered in under both state law and community charter. I printed 5 copies, but I wasn't done. One principle kept appearing in my research: riparian rights, the legal protection ensuring property owners could access and reasonably use the water adjacent to their land. These weren't optional, they were foundational. The HOA might control land access routes, but they couldn't deny me my legal right to use the shoreline, especially if the dock physically connected to my property. Still, I wanted something more, something irrefutable. I remembered the base. Every spring, they gathered around the dock. Big ones, spawning in the gravel shallows below. I'd watch them without thinking twice. But now I saw potential leverage. A quick search led me to Dr. Leah Tran, a freshwater biologist at the regional university. Her research focused on bass reproduction in inland lakes. I sent her an email with photos notes and observations from the past 2 years. I expected a polite dismissal. Instead, she called me the next day with interest and urgency in her voice. The patterns I described suggested that the area around my dock might be a primary spawning site for spotted bass, a species with protective status during breeding season under state environmental law. If verified, it could trigger mandatory buffer zones, construction restrictions, and potentially derail any plans for a new pier. By that weekend, Dr. Tran and I were in wetsuits conducting a field survey. She moved like someone who knew the language of the lake. The way gravel beds sat, the subtle currents that shaped aquatic vegetation, the temperature gradients that fish preferred, what I saw as water. She read like a story. What she found confirmed it. My dock didn't just sit on the water, it protected it. And now, it wasn't just mine to defend. It was part of the ecosystem. And the state had something to say about that. 3 days after Dr. Tran confirmed the spawning grounds beneath my dock, a team of landscapers in neon vests arrived at the edge of my property. Without so much as a knock or notice, they began unloading metal fence panels and concrete footers. I stepped outside in silence, phone in hand, documenting everything. Miranda stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching like a monarch surveying her conquest. The fence went up quickly, an ugly industrial wall slicing across the narrow 6-foot access path from my yard to the dock. Technically, the HOA claimed that strip of land was common property and presented a potential liability risk. They weren't removing the dock. They said just protecting the community from harm. They framed it as compromise. I saw it for what it was: siege warfare. The next day, I received a certified letter from the HOA citing my ongoing non-compliance with Article 4.7 of the Community Covenant and notifying me of a $250 daily fine. The language was formal, but venomous intentional. They wanted me pressured, isolated, financially bled out. By the end of the week, they had deactivated our key fobs to the pool clubhouse and gated parking. When Melanie's yoga group met at the pavilion, her name had been mysteriously removed from the roster. It wasn't just legal anymore. It was personal. Word of the dispute spread quickly through the community. Some neighbors avoided eye contact. Others offered cautious nods or half whispers of support. But a growing faction rallied behind Miranda. They accused me of threatening the future of the fishing festival, of disrespecting the traditions of Cedar Lake, of being an outsider, trying to reshape a place I didn't understand. Flyers began appearing on windshields with slogans like "Protect the Festival" and "Preserve our community." The timing wasn't accidental. The festival was only weeks away. They were setting the stage for blame. If the event got canceled or downsized due to environmental restrictions, they wanted a scapegoat ready-made. Me. Meanwhile, I continued gathering support in quieter ways. Walter, a retired environmental lawyer who lived 2 lots down, became my closest ally. He helped me draft formal complaints to the county land office and the Department of Natural Resources. Sophia Lynn, a fellow homeowner who'd fought Miranda on solar panel restrictions, reached out with stories eerily similar to mine. Selective enforcement, personal grudges, disguised as policy. But the pressure was mounting, the fines were growing, and the community was fracturing. What had once been backyard bonfires and paddleboard races was now gossip, suspicion, and lawn signs picking sides. The fence they built wasn't just physical, it was psychological. But what Miranda didn't know was that I had already triggered something she couldn't control. A state-level investigation was underway. A scientist had filed a report, and the lake was speaking through data, biology, and law. She might control the HOA, but she didn't control nature. The letter from the Department of Natural Resources arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier in a windbreaker bearing the state seal. It was formal, direct, and stamped with urgency. Effective immediately. All construction activity near the lakefront, including the proposed community pier, was suspended, pending environmental review. The basis preliminary findings of a critical fish spawning habitat in the waters beneath and around my dock. I read it twice before the weight of it truly landed. They hadn't just paused the pier. They'd frozen the entire shoreline. The sign went up the next day, bolted to a steel stake at the entrance to the construction zone protected habitat. No entry. Violation of this order may result in civil penalties. It stood like a sentry beside the HOA's glossy festival banners, now rendered meaningless. The neighborhood erupted. Some were livid, convinced that I had single-handedly sabotaged their beloved tradition. Others, quiet until now, started asking questions. Why hadn't the HOA conducted an environmental assessment before pushing the pier? What gave them the right to ignore natural ecosystems in favor of lakeside aesthetics? Why was Miranda so intent on pushing this project without public discussion? Whispers turned to murmurs. Misinformation clashed with fact. And then the DNR sent Director William Foster himself to a public meeting to explain the suspension. He was calm, precise, and mercilessly neutral. The spawning grounds, he explained, weren't theory. They were documented, photographed, and supported by environmental law. Any construction in the affected area could destroy the breeding patterns of the local bass population, leading to long-term ecological damage. The protection order wasn't about me. It was about preserving a living system older than any HOA charter. That shifted the room. Longtime residents, especially those who had fished here since childhood, stood up in support. They remembered when bass were scarce and the lake ran shallow in bad years. They understood what it meant to preserve something, not just for this year's festival, but for the next generation of anglers. I offered a solution. I proposed opening my dock, still accessible and within the buffer zone, but designated a low-impact area to limited community use during the adjusted festival. A temporary win-win. But Miranda called it blackmail, doubled down on the fines, and stormed out. That night, Victor Ramirez, the most senior member of the HOA board, called an emergency vote of no confidence. The room was packed. He spoke plainly. Not about law, but about trust, about leadership that served itself, about fences, both literal and figurative. Then came the vote, unanimous, save for one abstention. Miranda Kellerman was removed from her post as HOA president. By week's end, the fence blocking my dock was gone, and for the first time in months, Cedar Lake felt like home again. The new HOA president, Lisa Raymond, a soft-spoken environmental attorney who had moved in just a year prior, approached me with something that had been missing since all this began: respect. Under her leadership, The board not only removed the fence, but issued a formal apology, acknowledged the legality of my dock, and extended an invitation to collaborate on a revised community plan for the lake's future. Together, we worked with the DNR to craft a sustainable vision. The festival returned smaller, wiser, but no less joyful. My dock became the new launch point, shared respectfully under a sign that read, "Community, stewardship starts here." Families lined up each morning, fishing rods in hand, kids laughing, elders nodding in approval as the lake shimmered beneath early sun. Educational kiosks were installed near the shoreline, funded in part by the fines Miranda had once levied against me. They explained bass, spawning cycles, responsible catch and release, and the importance of shoreline vegetation. What had started as a feud ended as a classroom. Miranda. She moved out quietly in the fall, her lakefront home sold to a couple from out of state. Word had it she'd filed one last legal challenge, but it was dismissed as meritless before winter's first frost. Her allies had faded with the last echo of her authority. As for me, I sat once again at the edge of the dock, the board still firm beneath me, the initials SH59. Catching golden light. I wasn't just protecting planks and nails. I'd defended something deeper. The soul of a place, the right to belong. The legacy of a man who believed in building something that could outlast storms. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from a gavel. Sometimes, it comes from standing your ground quietly, stubbornly, until truth catches up. And when it does, you don't just win, you rebuild better.